Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Hannah Moore from the QLF office in Montreal, and I'll be serving as your Zoom IT host today. We're just going to wait another moment and let some more people join, and we will begin the episode shortly. Okay, I think we're looking pretty good. Thank you for your patience, everybody, and we're ready to begin. It's now my pleasure to introduce QLF President Beth Alling, who will serve as today's moderator. So Beth, I'll invite you to turn on your video and microphone.
Thank you, Hannah. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of QLF's webinar series, Voices of QLF. We are very pleased that you've joined us for a review of QLF's early years, highlighting the aviation ministry of Robert A. Bryan, QLF founder, bush pilot, and Anglican minister. And now may I ask our panelists to unmute your video and audio. Okay, we're all here. Great. It is a wonderful pleasure and honor to introduce our guests, and I will do so in the order in which they appear on camera. First is Ed Miller. In the mid-60s and early 70s, Ed spent 2 summers as Bob Bryan's co-pilot and 1 winter as a parish priest in Harrington Harbor on the Quebec North Shore in the heart of QLF's home region. During this time, Ed produced 16mm films documenting the early days of aviation ministry on the North Shore. We will share brief film clips with you today. Ed is a recently retired Episcopal minister and serves as the vice chair of the QLF US Board of Directors. Ed joins us from Virginia. Next is Tom Matthews. In the 1970s, Tom served as the interim director of the school board, which represents 16 communities along the Quebec North Shore and beyond. During this time, Tom and his family lived in Mutton Bay, Harrington, and Chevry. Tom's father, Timothy Matthews, was the bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Quebec. Tom joins us from the eastern townships of Quebec. Raised in St. Paul's River on the Quebec North Shore is Philip Nadeau. Bob Bryan quickly recognized the promise of this young man and made arrangements for Philip to attend Choate School in Connecticut, where he, Bob, served as the chaplain. Giving back to his home region, QLF, and to Bob Bryan, Philip spent summers as a community service volunteer in the late 60s and early 70s, based in Labrador, the Quebec North Shore, and Maine. Philip is the former chair of the QLF Canada Board of Directors and a current honorary director. Philip joins us from Vermont. And now R.L. Smith. As with Philip and Ed, R.L. attended Choate School, where he was recruited by Bob Bryan to serve as a QLF volunteer, and soon thereafter, his co-pilot. In the mid-60s, R.L. spent his first summer in Kagaska and Salmon Bay, and in Conch, Newfoundland in later years. While based in Harrington Harbor in 67 and 68, R.L. was Bob's co-pilot. R.L. joins us in Massachusetts. Kerry, Bryan, Brokaw hardly needs an introduction to our audience. The Bryan family, Bob and Faith, Kerry, Sarah, and Sandy, spent extended periods of time in Harrington Harbor. Notably, Kerry served as a QLF volunteer over 8 summers and a co-pilot for her father later on. In the early years especially, the friendships and bonds formed between the Bryan family, QLF volunteers and co-pilots with the people and the communities on the coast were an essential element of Bob Bryan's aviation ministry. Kerry joins us from Idaho. And now I turn to Ed Miller to guide us through the stories of Bob Bryan's unique contributions to aviation ministry.
Thank you, Beth, very much. We're all delighted to be with you today and spend this hour together. But before we begin in what we hope will be an enjoyable conversation for the next hour, a comment on behalf of Beth and my QLF colleagues about this day in the world. Since its founding, QLF has been committed to supporting communities through mutual appreciation, collaboration, and a focus on a sustainable future with care for natural resources and for one another. Given the global reach of QLF, the war initiated by Russia in Ukraine today cannot go unnoticed. Each in our own way, we invite you to join in lament over war and prayers for peace, mindful of those who suffer from the consequences of war both innocent casualties and those sent to fight. The aviation ministry of Bob Bryan began in 1955. Bob and Faith rang the doorbell at the bishop's house in Quebec City. Bob, a divinity student at the time, had picked up a pamphlet in the nearby cathedral which described the Anglican Diocese of Quebec. It covers 250,000 square miles with Anglican churches scattered throughout the vast land. The pamphlet included a promise to the people. It makes no difference how few and far between they are. We will be there, somehow, sometime. The bishop answered the doorbell and invited Bob and Faith in for tea and a conversation. Bob and the bishop kept in touch. The promise to the people to be there somehow, sometime, kept coming back to Bob. And 4 years later, that promise took hold of him. In December of 1959, Bishop Carrington wrote the following words to Bob. With regard to your wonderful offer to serve our North Shore in the summer, we are only too glad to accept your offer. We shall be very happy to have you. And so they went, first in the summer of 1960, and then each summer and during winters as well. No one could have known then that the promise to be there somehow, sometime would be adopted by Bob as his work and ministry in a lifetime of adventure. But so it was. Our focus today is on the early years, the 1960s and 70s. And we start this webinar by taking you to Harrington Harbor with Bob.
We're flying over Harrington Harbor, one of the isolated communities of the North Shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. These and other villages in Newfoundland and Labrador were settled in the 19th century by fishermen, men who were willing to endure extreme hardships because of the abundance of codfish, the salmon, and the fur seal. Harrington is 800 miles east of Montreal and the same distance northeast of Boston. But no roads connect Harrington to larger cities. And the only access to it and other towns is by air and sea.
So let's go back to the beginning for a moment. Bob Bryan was the first minister on the coast to fly his own plane, and the idea caught on quickly. Now, Tom Matthews, who's here this morning, knows the story well. Bob introduced what the church for a time expanded. So Tom, welcome. Having lived and worked on the coast for the school board in your field of education, you know about the use of planes by Bob and then additional clergy in the 60s and 70s, and also from your experience as a lay reader. So tell us first about what made ministry possible that was otherwise impossible because of clergy who were pilots, and then just mention briefly to us the clergy pilot colleagues who knew Bob.
Well, in those days, it was really difficult to get from one community to another, except by the ships that plied the coast, the Jean Bryan in those days, and later on the Fort Megan. But they only made weekly trips, and of course, in freeze up and in the wintertime, they couldn't do it. The airplane was the only way to manage to access the whole of the lower North Shore. And when people needed a minister for whatever, or needed help in their communities, they would often turn to the clergy. And Bob was down on the coast doing wonderful work for quite a few years before he'd heard about Jim Young, who was flying out of a cubby out of the Magdalen Islands, and talked to Jim into coming down with the promise of an aircraft to help serve the people that Bob couldn't serve because there was only Bob. So Jim went down and with his aircraft, first it was RSC, a Cessna, then later on a LFH, another 180. They served all the coast from Kagaska to Blanc Sablon on wheels and skis and floats. They had a ministry of serving persons. They went to the villages to, of course, do collective church services, but they did an awful lot of individual ministry as well, carrying people from village to village who needed to be taken to hospitals or needed to visit sick people. They worked ceaselessly and tirelessly, except in thaw and freeze up and thaw as much as they possibly could. Later on, that aircraft that Jim had was supplemented by a Super Cub. I think that Bob had a hand in getting that as well. And so thanks to Bob's ministry on the coast and the encouragement for that ministry to expand, there was an awful lot of good work done by the flying clergy of the lower North Shore, not just to the Anglican communities, but to any person who wished to be served by Bob and his friends in the ministry. John Blick followed Jim Young after he became a school board employee and a part-time priest, and he was followed by John Neal.
That's a great introduction, and we're going to talk a little bit more about ministry in just a moment. We have a film clip that I think will resonate with you, but especially with Tom, and you'll see why in a moment. And this film clip, I hope, will set the scene for stories to come about the unusual nature of ministry on the coast. Watch now as Bishop Timothy Matthews, Tom's father, talks about the essence of ministry everywhere, and especially on the coast.
Well, I remember the first time I flew over Mutton Bay after my son Tom and his wife and little family had moved in there. And I found myself looking out of the otter and wondering which of all the houses down there was occupied by Tommy and Barbara. And it seemed to me that this was the one thing I was looking for, Tom and Barbara. And afterwards I realized that this is ministry. You don't really minister to people so much as to persons. And maybe that's the way God looks towards us and thinks of us all as separate, special persons for whom he has a profound love and care.
To be there somehow, sometime became a mantra for ministering to persons and not to people. Let's return for a moment to aviation. The times were just right for Bob to blend ministry with the aviation because it was actually a very extraordinary era. First, he had an innate love of people and a love of flying as well. Growing up on Long Island, New York, he lived near several important aircraft manufacturing companies during the 30s and 40s. So he knew about planes and watched them at nearby airports. In the post-World War II era in the 1950s, former military pilots, just a little older than Bob, who wanted to continue flying, and the emergence of general aviation created the rapid development of small planes. Some of you may have seen old brochures in that era that even predicted a plane in every garage. Well, that was not to be. With the growth of general aviation, however, came the discovery that planes could provide transportation in remote areas, otherwise inaccessible. Bush flying, as it was known, was used for many professional purposes, including ministry. The Cessna 185 airplane, which became a much revered bush plane, was first produced in 1961. Bob has his first Cessna 185 by 1963. And incidentally, just as an aside, the first production Skidoo was made in 1959. It too was designed at first for improving transportation in remote areas and later became a recreation vehicle. Choate students will likely remember the novelty of seeing the Bryans on a Skidoo in the school fields. Now, just 10 years before Bob started flying to Canada, Bishop William Gordon, the Episcopal Bishop of what was then the Missionary District of Alaska, remember Alaska was not a state until 1959, Bishop Gordon started flying in order to visit parishes by air instead of the lengthy trips required by boat. His planes were funded by contributions from a National Episcopal Church organization, and this was very well known. Around the time Bob and Faith went to the cathedral in Quebec, Bishop Gordon tried to recruit Bob to go to Alaska. But Bob, who was recruited by other schools and other organizations and churches, was drawn more and more to the lower North Shore. What began at first as a parish ministry quickly developed into what we know as QLF, the Quebec-Labrador Foundation. After just one summer on the coast, Bob had an idea: bring in high school students to the coast for a cross-cultural experience in being part of a community as in a place far from home. It began with just a few people in 1961 who could all stand together on one airplane float, and grew by the late 1960s to over 100 summer volunteers, as we were called, in Quebec, Labrador, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and Maine. That's a story for another day. For now, the important point is that the origin of QLF was based on the trust Bob had established with the people of the coast through his ministry. It was also based on Bob's appeal as a school chaplain to young people who were seeking a summer of meaningful engagement. And without Bob's ministry, there would likely not be a QLF. While most volunteers were based in one community, one or two each summer were with Bob. That meant helping with the plane as an extra hand. We who had that job had memorable experiences. R.L. Smith was one of those volunteers, and he joins us today, as you've heard a moment ago. So R.L., tell us, what was flying with Bob like? And how did you see Bob's ministry unfold during your time in the plane?
Well, simply put it, flying with Bob was probably the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life. Every flight with Bob was an adventure. Some were more adventurous than others, but each trip was new and interesting, sometimes hectic, given the way Bob schedules his life, sometimes dangerous, but always a thrill to me. The question of how I saw Bob's ministry unfold is a great question, and I hadn't really thought about it until I sat down and really thought about it overnight. But because not everybody was lucky or perhaps blessed enough to fly with Bob. So just a little background for those who may not know me. Bob and his family had been on sabbatical on the coast my freshman year at Choate, which was 64, 65. And so I met Bob, or Bear, as many people call them, when he returned to Choate as I started my sophomore year. Bob was the chaplain at Choate. I got to know him as my crew coach during the 3 years, where he became both a mentor of sorts and a friend. The first time I went to the coast was the summer of 65, turning 16 while living in a small platform tent in the summer fishing village of Salmon Bay, not far from where Phil Nadeau was in St. Paul's River. And I was with Craig Battle and a Choate master named Bob Elmore. I was immediately taken by the coast, the people, the sea, the sense of place, Bob's plane, and Bob. I got my private license over the summer of 66, so I might be lucky enough to get the coveted position as Bob's co-pilot in 69 Easy, his Helio carrier, and the summer after I graduated from Choate, which I did. It was only then, while flying with Bob, that he began to reveal himself to me as more than just a crew coach and a pilot and a teller of Bert and I stories, but he was also really a bona fide man of the cloth. He was a real Anglican priest. And in those first weeks flying with Bob, he kind of reminded me of Superman, leaving Harrington as Mr. Bryan and, having donned his frock and clerical collar in flight, emerging from 69 Easy in some small outport as Reverend or Father Bryan, ready to perform whatever rites or sacraments needed to be as he went from house to house. I learned there that there was this duality about Bob. Bob the teacher, Bob the crew coach, the prep school chaplain, and Bob the Anglican priest. And it wasn't always clear which persona was present at any given time. Our flights up and down the coast from Romaine to Nain and over to Newfoundland involved lots of different missions, checking on all Bob's volunteers at the various outports, transporting and delivering important goods between towns, Sundays, performing church services from dawn until dusk up and down the coast. And this really was a big part of the heart of Bob's coastal ministry. And lastly, he played the role of priest, family friend, and bush pilot to those who were in need on the coast. And just quickly, there are two stories I remember. In Harrington, while I was there, the call came in from Cross River, now called Chevry, that a young boy may have drowned, he'd gone missing. They couldn't find him by boat, so Bob and I hopped in 69 Easy and we went up, looked around, couldn't see a thing. Bob said, let's take it up a bit higher, and sure enough, clear as a bell, there was Gary Strickland's body on the bottom of the water. And we directed the boat to him, and they pulled him up with a grapeline and brought him into land. And then Bob, of course, went and sat with the family and ultimately did the service for him. And on another occasion, we got a call from Castor River where there was a very sick baby who was going to die, and he had to get to the hospital in St. Anthony. And so we crossed over the Straits of Belle Isle, and it was a nasty, foggy day, and it was only getting worse, deteriorating. And we flew, picking our way along the coast up to St. Anthony. But along the way, as we went into one of the deep fjords, Bob and I looked in front of us, and there was a sheer stone face of the end of the fjord right in front of us. And Bob put it into a steep left turn, and those slats on the helio came banging out, and she didn't stall, and she made the curve just in time to save our lives. And so, yeah, I remembered that. But so it was only after I returned from the coast that summer that I understood that Bob was not only a friend, but I really understood the designation that he got as the flying priest of Labrador. And just in closing, Bob's ministry wouldn't have been possible without a whole bunch of people tied together by their high frequency radios. And whether it was the loud jovial sound of Antoine and Blanc-Sablon or Grenfell Nurse and Flowers Cove, giving weather updates from the Straits of Belle Isle, these people were critical forms of assistant, news and weather and information, or just chat for Bob and his 6-9 Easy crews. So thank you for letting me share that, Ed.
Great. Thank you, RL, and we'll hear more later, but thank you very much. Bob really depended on volunteers like RL, but he also, as RL mentioned a moment ago, had an extensive network of support. Individual donors and foundations provided financial support. Mechanics and professional pilots kept the plane in superb condition and sometimes moved it to a new location to help Bob. And occasionally a mechanic would even be based in Harrington for a week or two for added attention. Flying in these remote areas was inherently dangerous. Wear and tear on the plane, especially with most landings on salt water, required vigilance to notice and repair small problems before they became serious. Navigation equipment, radios, and rescue beacons, rudimentary by today's standards, were also constantly checked and upgraded. Bob's focus in flying was always getting to the people somehow, sometime, and he was rarely dissuaded in that quest. Now, our next panelist is Philip Nadeau. Philip, who grew up in St. Paul's River. He has clear memories of Bob as priest. So welcome, Philip. You probably know as much as anyone about Bob's impact as a pilot and a priest. And I know you've got a number of good stories, so we'd like to hear some of them. Tell us a story or two from your experience.
Well, thank you, Ed, very much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with this distinguished group. I just have a couple of comments. I'm going to tell say a couple of things about Bob's relationship with the Dr. Donald Hod in Harrington. Dr. Hod, as he was known by or called by a lot of people on the coast. And then I'm going to tell a story that I think will certainly resonate with those of you who flew with him. I would just like to say that it's hard. I was thinking that it's really hard to imagine what the coast was like in the early 60s, and when I think about how the changes have come about since then, it's hard to think about all the changes that have taken place on the coast. I was in Harrington in 1963. I was there in the fall of 1963 because I had finished the 7th grade in St. Paul's River. And I guess my father had conspired with Grenfell Osborne and maybe with Bob even at that point in time. So I ended up in Harrington to start the 8th grade. And that's when I met Bob for the first time. My first impression of Bob, I met him with a few of the other students, and we were down near Cecil Rousel's store on the wharves there in Harrington. And he seemed bigger than life to all of us. He was in stature anyway, as you all know. But the other thing, my first impression of Bob was that he was wonderful at connecting with people, young, old, it didn't matter. And I think that one of the things of his ministry, when we talk about aviation ministry, and certainly is ministry for other people, there was no question that he utilized those connections very well. With Dr. Hod at Harrington, it was a very good combination because Dr. Hod was the only doctor on the coast at that point in time. He was affiliated with the International Grenfell Hospital in Harrington, which was a viable institution. And the two of them started a great collaboration because I remember, I think I was probably in a service or two when Dr. Hod would come and come in the back and subtly indicate to Bob that there was probably some kind of an emergency and Bob needed to respond to it. And so and Bob at that point, at one point in his book, described Dr. Hod as a man of quiet dignity, which he was, and a wonderful being, a human being. So, and the other thing that I remember about their relationship was if there was an emergency, not only was Bob called to be the pilot and go and pick, whoever was up and to take them either back to Harrington or some hospital. But in some cases, if those emergencies turned out bad, he would have to obviously console the families and conduct the funeral. So he was really just an incredible person with a mission and with not a lot of time to spare because he was always on his way somewhere else. And that was a frustration for people because they wanted to, anytime they saw him, they wanted to visit more with him. And RL and you would know that just from being on the airplane with him. But the thing that I remember most about Bob and Dr. Hod was that people trusted Bob. He was a man that if he said he was going to do something, he did it. And it wasn't because he was a man of the cloth so much, I think, as that he didn't make false promises, as those of you know him well. But when he said he was going to do something, he did, and he could be trusted implicitly, and had great respect for the people in Harrington and all up and down the coast. He knew people in each of the towns, so he was very well known. And it's hard to not be well known when you fly a yellow airplane, as Bob did, always with yellow, as he called it, the yellow plane with black strips. And I will segue from there to a story about Don Keats. RL knows Frank Cates, or knew Frank Cates when he was based in Salmon Bay. Don Keats was actually born in Harrington Harbor and was born by Dr. Hod, as they say. And he was the son of Frank Keats and Hazel Keats, who lived in Salmon Bay in the summer. And on September 25th in 1963, he and a friend were out messing around behind Salmon Bay, a few miles behind Salmon Bay. And one of them had a shotgun, and it was a 12-gauge shotgun, and it accidentally discharged and shot off Don's left hand, basically, not completely, but it was fired at such close range that it didn't blow his arm off or do any more damage. And that started, they were 4 miles from the town of Salmon Bay. And this is the beginning of the miracle. We're going to talk a little later about communication on the coast. Here's the beginning of that miracle. His friend was 4 years older, 16 at the time, and had the presence of mind to tear up his t-shirt and make a tourniquet. And I'm sure it wasn't because of any prior training that he had in this kind of area. I think it was just obviously something that he felt he had to do. and that managed to sort of obviously slow down some of the bleeding. And then they managed to get back to the village, walk, and Don said he did 95% of the walking. So you can imagine what was going through his mind. And they managed to get back to the village, and Don's father, Frank, was there, and he took over at that point in time. And the second part of that miracle was that there were ships, this was in September, and there were boats in Salmon Bay loading fish that the fishermen had caught during all during the summer. So they were loading basically dried and salt fish on the boats. And the first call that, the first distress call that went out was from one of those ships that was loading cod to another ship in Newfoundland, who relayed the message to Harrington Harbor. And the ship captain, or whoever was the radio operator in Harrington, relayed the message to Dr. Hod and Bob, and they were on their way. So they, and Don, meanwhile, was on his way down to Lourdes de Blasablanc from Salmon Bay, and he was on one of the fishing boats who was kind enough to take him. And that journey took at least a couple of hours. It wasn't a matter of minutes, because it's a 55 kilometer drive, at least these days, to get to Lourdes. So, and it was a very rough day, as it turned out. So Don and the people with him finally got to Lourdes. And I think Bob and Dr. Hod was probably waiting for them, because they would have been the last two. And you could imagine all the time that's transpired. But Don did not have get a blood transfusion until he got to Lourdes. And then Dr. Hod operated on him, but because of the time difference and the amount of time it took from the accident, when the accident took place, to get him to Blasablanc, Dr. Hod had to amputate above the elbow. So he was not able to save his arm, but at least be able to stabilize him. And then Don and Bob must have flown him back the following day, because at that point, Bob and Dr. Hod and Don flew him from Lourdes back to Harrington, and Don spent the better part of a month recovering from that shotgun wound. And it's a miracle. Clearly, God wanted Don Cates to live during that episode, because he's now and he grew up to be a healthy young man, and a fisherman, fishes with his brother still in St. Paul's River. And it's just remarkable. And the other thing I will say about Don is, this is his story, and I'm really sorry I'm the one who's telling it, but it's a remarkable story. He is also my brother-in-law, and I know him well, and he comes from a wonderful family, and has a terrific life, thanks to Bob and Dr. Hod. That's it.
Thanks, Philip, very much. Thank you. Just got to click on mute there. Thank you so much. Well, communication, as I said earlier, was rudimentary at best. And as RL mentioned, there were no telephones in this area in this early era at all. And there were some radios that RL spoke of. But in addition to those, Bob arranged for the donation of radios to be placed in the parsonages of clergy and the homes of lay leaders of churches without resident ministers. These radios were used for twice daily conversations called skeds to share news of the weather, status of sick parishioners who might need transportation for medical care, occasionally local gossip, and other items of concern. And they were generally always on. And the winter I was there, I was quite familiar with these twice daily conversations. Bob and other clergy pilots relied on these radios as the only local means of letting people know where they were. In an emergency, a radio call on these frequencies might be the only notification of trouble. So to introduce our next segment. Listen for just a moment to Les Foreman on the sked from Kagaska.
City Air 370, City Air 371. 370, Roger, good evening, Ronnie. I was talking to Mr. Bryan last night. I don't know if you was on this morning, Ronnie, or not. I was talking to Mr. Bryan last night, and they'll be on the coast, all the family, they'll be down on the 22nd. All the girls and Mrs. Bryan, they'll be down on the 22nd of December, so they'll be spending all but a month with us before they go back.
Well, we're delighted that Kerry Bryan Brokaw is on this webinar, and that's her introduction. So Kerry, as Les says in the sked, you're on your way to Harrington. Take us there.
Thank you so much, Ed. I love that. I love hearing all the stories, the other panelists, and just hearing Les's voice there talking from Kagaska to Riney Robertson. No, Les in Kagaska, yes, talking to Riney in Tabatcher. I love that. It's such a classic sound from back then. And I was thinking of the sounds of Harrington. Aside from the sked, there was the putt-putt of the fishing boats always in the harbor. The fishermen would leave at 2 in the morning and return at 8 in the morning, full of cod and surrounded by seagulls. There was the sound of the oil drums being rolled on the granite and the boardwalks, either full or of fuel or empty or full of water. We had no electricity or running water. So in winter, those drums were used to haul water from the mainland on Comatic. That was one of our sources of drinking water. Of course, Dad had the fuel stored, the aviation fuel stored in drums. There was the sound of the dogs. There were hundreds of dogs, hundreds of huskies on the island and in all of the villages. Each family had a dog team. It was the only mode of transportation in winter. And the dogs lived in dog houses made from old boats cut in half. And you could hear them yelping at mealtime and howling at night, particularly in the winter. They sounded like wolves. The sound of the plane brought kids from all over Harrington running down to the harbor. We'd hear that distant hum, and then we'd get the buzz over the island before he landed and taxied in. Dad was gone a lot. He was flying to other parishes a lot of the time, so there was great excitement upon his return. And of course, he was so full of energy and fun and stories. And the plane was a novelty. And in winter, we could see him come in on the skis and then wrap the plane up with the sleeves on the propeller and the wings. So Mom was home base for my sisters, Sarah and Sandy, and me in Harrington. She fully immersed herself in the community. She loved it. I can hear her laughing and joking. There was a rhythm to the week on the coast, and Mom fully delved into this with the other women. Monday was wash day. Mom would roll the old Maytag ringer washer out onto the rocks and fill it up with a hose. So each house had a gravity-fed hose from a pond on the hill that provided water. We'd fill the cisterns with that. And so she'd use that to fill the washer. And just down the hill, Betty Rousel and Mary Rousel were doing their laundry and hanging it on their lines. So there was lots of laughter and conviviality. And I just, on the whole coast on a Monday, the laundry is still hanging and blowing in the wind. So one of the days in this rhythm of the week was bread day, baking day. And Mom learned to make the delicious homemade bread on the wood cook stove. She cooked everything on that stove. Saturday was bath day. So she'd fill the bath with water heated on that stove. And then each of us sequentially took turns in the bath, in that same bath. And she'd just keep it warm with more pots of water from the stove. Sunday was, of course, rest day. And nobody fished on that day, but you'd hear the boats coming in from the outer islands for services. And there was the sound of the clanging of the bells and the beautiful resounding hymns led by Marth. What a friend we have in Jesus, eternal Father, strong to save, which is for those in peril on the sea. And then, of course, the cadence of Dad's voice. And we'd love to go with Dad to the other villages for services and visits, sometimes on a Sunday or other days of the week. So we went to Elmer Sound and Cross River, St. Paul's, DeBatcher, and Mutton Bay. And Mutton Bay had that really bumpy landing because you had the wind coming over the hills. We spent a lot of time in Kagaska with the Foremans there, and up at Kagaska River, especially when Dad was going to point south. And Wolf Bay was one of our favorite places to go. Wolf Bay had kind of a tricky landing. It's an island, it's about 30 miles offshore. It has a narrow cove. So you could only land in one direction, and there often was a crosswind. Woo, love that. I love that picture there, that film. In fact, there was an otter on to the left that didn't quite make its landing and went through a shed. There were no fatalities, and that was always there. But Dad would slip on that cassock standing on the float of the plane. And once he opened the back door where the daughters were, and his communion kit, which actually had been Mom's grandfather's communion kit from the late 1800s, went tumbling out of the plane and splashed in the water. It was jigged up later. But so there were about 5 houses at Wolf Bay, and we'd all gather in Uncle Henry and Aunt Vaughn's house for a service. And Dad would lead us in prayer and in a hymn, and we would have communion, breaking the homemade bread that she had made. And he would always end each service with, "O Lord, support us all the day long, till the shadows lengthen and evening comes and the busy world is hushed and the fever of life is over and our work is done. Then in thy great mercy, grant us holy rest and peace at the last. Amen." And then we would catch up. The adults would catch up. My sisters and I would go play at Cynthia's. They had Cynthia's my friend to this day. Her dad's old boat became a playhouse. I'm gonna just end with Calcasieu, because there was one house in Calcasieu. That was Alf and Ina and Gladys and Miva, and we would have communion there. And Gladys is now an ordained minister and working at the church in Kagaska. And Gladys and Linda Stubbert, who grew up in Harrington, but now lives in Sept-Îles, they presided at the services in 2019 for Dad. So that's just painting a picture.
Wonderful, wonderful pictures. And I love your talk about your comments about all the sounds, and just amazing. So thank you. Thank you, Kerry, very much.
Thank you, Ed.
Bob's ministry and the possibilities that aviation offered contributed to Bob's devotion to the wider church in the Diocese of Quebec. Eventually named Archdeacon with responsibilities for management and supervision of the Anglican churches from Cédille to Planceblanc, he was always encouraging the vitality of the church. One activity he enjoyed the most was taking the bishop to towns along the coast. Bishops were expected to go to each parish to be supportive and to confirm young people and adults. And Bob helped make this possible. Watch now as Bishop Matthews talks about flying on the coast as he climbs into a charter plane flown by Randy Cox, a Harrington native, on a rare occasion when Bob was unavailable due to an emergency.
You know, the lifeline down there, the flying on the North Shore is really something. Sometimes you really hardly ever know what's going to happen next. And in our case, the minister's wife looks out the window, and if she can see the furthest pole that hangs up the coastline, then she thinks there's enough visibility for a flight somewhere. And then she goes and looks through all the windows, and she says, it's okay in the east, it's okay in the north, it's okay somewhere else. And this is the way we do it.
One of Bishop Matthews' successors is Bishop Bruce Stavert. Now retired, he'd been a priest at St. Paul's River and Old Fort Bay, so returning as bishop each year was like returning home. Bishop Stavert is not able to join us today. We do have a letter from him to Bob when Bishop Stavert became the Bishop of Quebec in 1991. It included the following words: "I would think that I could fill several pages in describing the tremendous assistance you have been to the work of the Anglican Church on the coast as a result of your flying. I know also that in recent years you have been of enormous assistance with the aircraft in helping the bishop with an annual visitation to the coast. I'm looking forward as the new bishop to being able to do that with you. I talked with Bishop Stavert 2 weeks ago, and he had two immediate recollections about flying with Bob. First, he remembers being asked to look down from the right seat of the plane to check clotheslines to see the direction clothes were blowing in the wind as a guide for landing. A windsock, if you will. He also mentioned Bob's office, a duffel bag overflowing with what Bishop Stavert called lots of random stuff. Oddly, despite the accuracy of the bishop's observation, Bob was fastidious about at least two things. One was an obsession with making sure the wheels were up for landing on the water with amphibious floats and down for landing on the land. And the other was keeping virtually every piece of correspondence he had. This record keeping has become absolutely invaluable as QLF goes back and takes a look at what Bob did and what he said and what he wrote at various times in his ministry. So we reached a point where I think it's a good time to ask panelists to say a little bit more. What have we missed? What comes to you spontaneously? We have about 4, maybe 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that. So I'm known for trying to end meetings on time. So pardon me if I'm looking at the clock from time to time, but we'll try to end at 1. But let's take 4 or 5 minutes. Anything that comes to mind that wasn't said or that you'd like to add? Philip, I know you had a thought, but.
Sorry, having trouble unmuting. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to say a couple of words about Kerry's mom. I mean, in addition to what she said, because I met, Faith was an unbelievable person. She was a beautiful, beautiful person in every respect. She was kind, she was caring, she was generous, she was hospitable, and she was flexible to a point, to a fault when it came to Bob. And Bob was certainly the heart of QLF, is still. But Faith, I think, was the soul of QLF. And even though she might have been in the background, she had a real presence. And people, as Kerry said, the people in the communities that met her thought she was a wonderful person. And they made a great team throughout that ministry. So I don't think, I think of Faith as being the salt of the earth. And I don't think QLF would be anything like what it is today without her. So that's the thought I have, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As you were talking about Bob's bag, Ed, I couldn't help but remember the time his briefcase was his other office, as it were.
Yep.
And the briefcase was the mission. And it went overboard one day. I remember it went overboard from 6-9 Easy, and I get to whatever hook there was and get it before it sank. And that was his lifeline. I'm glad it didn't go down to the bottom because he would have been lost.
One area we haven't covered was his interest in aviation in general and his association with both the Seaplane Pilots Association and other things, and other groups. And someone told me not too long ago, because I'd been to the seaplane fly-in, the annual seaplane fly-in in Greenville, Maine in September once. But apparently the first year they started a contest, which they continued each year, to see who could get a plane off the water the fastest. And there was some pretty intense competition. And as you know, Bob was not that laid back on things like that. And he was determined that the Helio would be the first off the water. So the first year, he apparently actually went to the extent of having the amphibious floats, which would have been too heavy, taken off and temporarily replaced or exchanged with a borrowed pair, they were legal floats, but borrowed pair of straight floats without wheels. And of course, he emptied the plane, took everything he could think of out, put just enough fuel in to get him up and back. And of course, he took off first and won the contest that year. Other thoughts? Any? Tom, any other recollections that come to mind?
Well, I can remember that he flew over to Newfoundland a lot, and he also flew up the Labrador coast, all the way up the Labrador coast, visiting and performing his ministry up there as well, and not just for Quebec Labrador, but he flew up because he was a priest, and he had people, or as my dad would say, he had persons to serve. And so he developed in that way a connection of people from all over the place. Anacostia Island, the Gaspé, every village had somebody that he could talk to who would communicate with them readily on any needs or any wants or any observations about the status of the village. So Bob became kind of like a central for the Lower North Shore in those years. If he'd been able to speak French, he would have been completely submerged in that role. And I think over the years, he wished he could speak French because he served everybody.
I think one time he referred, trying French, he referred to, with a big laugh, he referred to the cuisine volante, by which he meant the flight kitchen in Sept-Îles. I don't know that anybody understood what he was saying, but I do remember that phrase, which was not part of our French courses at Choate, I can assure you. Well, anything else? And Beth's asked me to make a few closing comments, and I'm happy to do that, but I don't want to cut anybody off before we finish. And I have a note, but we'll figure this all out. I have a note on the chat that Beth may have lost power. She's not in the meeting at the moment, but we'll carry on as best we can. And Hannah, you can jump in if you need to at the end. So Beth asked me to make some comments, and they're a variation on what I said in another time, but comments from my own experience. And just to say that this retrospective has been everything and more than I thought it would be. And I was just delighted to be asked to be sort of the timekeeper and the MC. But these stories are terrific, and I really hadn't heard any of them before. So this retrospective has been fun to plan and really enjoyable to share. And joining with longtime friends at Beth Request has been so wonderful. There's actually an added dimension to this day for me. 48 years ago, on February 24th, Bishop Matthews presided at my ordination as a priest. The idea for his presence and the plan to bring him to the service was Bob's. Although I do remember at the last minute, right about this time in the early afternoon, Bob was not so sure he had the time zone straight and wasn't sure whether the bishop would be an hour early or an hour late. Turned out he was right on time. For that, I've always been grateful. It was the beginning of a long friendship with several generations of the Matthews family. Now, fond memories could easily romanticize and soften the rough edges of having accompanied Bob in ministry and in flight. It was, in a very real way, living on the edge between land and water in the summer, or land and ice in the winter. And we've all heard stories of people on skidoos who saw ice and didn't realize that a half an inch below the ice was water and went off the edge. The edge between majestic beauty and harsh reality. The edge between security and catastrophe. The edge between serenity and fear. A sudden fog bank or a snow squall out of nowhere. A gust with a bottomless downdraft. A high ridge of trees at the end of a lake. The slightest change in the sound of an engine that no one else was close enough to hear. These moments and others jolted us out of the tranquility we loved and sought. And the people of the coast lived as we lived, doing what we could to be prudent, assessing the risks, and knowing that just over the edge, life and sometimes death was beyond our control. Since 1534, when Jacques Cartier first called the Lower North Shore the land God gave Cain, it seemed sometimes that this land might be a place of exile forgotten by God, a hostile place over the treacherous edge. But from biblical times onward, the experience of the sacred, the experience of God in holy places, has often been associated with stunning mountaintops, often clouded, with the stillness of wilderness, with landscapes unspoiled by disruptive human habitation. And the Lower North Shore was filled with these kinds of places too. What I learned from the beginning on the coast was to trust in the words of the psalm that if I take the wings of the morning or dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, God is there. Yes, I trusted in Bob, his intuition, his skill, his experience. Yes, I trusted in a complicated airplane that was built to withstand crashes. Yes, I trusted in the men who took me to sea in summer and winter. And yes, I trusted in people we all knew who lived with sorrow from the destructive reality of the edges of life, but whose resilience and faith, while mostly unspoken, was revealed in hospitality, in the nasal sounds of singing hymns that Kerry mentioned, in quietly sitting with anyone who entered, and in not abandoning life. Living on the edge in these places, I have discovered, is not as different from living anywhere as I once thought. And what makes all this difference is that Bishop Matthews had it right. God has a profound love for each of us, and I believe that God will not rest without finding us somehow, sometime.
Thank you, Ed, so much for your very, very thoughtful, wise words. Thank you. And I'm terribly sorry we lost an internet connection in this building here in Ipswich, but I'm glad to be back with you all. On behalf of all of us at QLF, I extend our thanks and great appreciation to our panelists for participating on this webinar today. Thank you, Ed, Tom, Philip, RL, and Kerry. Thanks so much. And we are especially grateful to you, Ed, for your thoughtful presentation, a well-crafted history with stories of defining moments of QLF's early years in aviation ministry. And finally, a special thanks to our webinar producer, Bill Steelman, webinar host, Hannah Moore, co-host, Krista Grant, and Kevin Porter, QLF's media archivist. Of note, this episode will soon be posted on our website. We hope you will join for the next webinar on Thursday, April 14th. Larry Morris, QLF President Emeritus, is the lead guest. Thank you for joining with us today. We send our best wishes to you.